Senior Wehrmacht commanders had been planning to launch a major counteroffensive against the Allies since mid-September. The objective of the attack was to capture Antwerp. Not only would the capture or destruction of Antwerp prevent supplies reaching the Allied armies, it would also split Allied forces in two, demoralizing the alliance and forcing its leaders to negotiate. For the attack, Hitler concentrated the best of his remaining forces in the west. 240,000 men in 28 divisions, with 1,200 tanks and assault guns. The offensive began at 05:30 on December the 16th, with a barrage by 900 German guns. 1 hour later, 3 German armies smashed into the American front line. By now, the front line in the west followed the course of the Roer, Our, and Saar rivers. In southern Belgium, the line faced the Ardennes, a hilly and in places heavily wooded region. It was through this area that Hitler intended to thrust towards the bridges over the River Meuse and the port of Antwerp. For the attack, the Germans had deployed the newly formed 6th Panzer Army, together with the 5th Panzer and 7th Army, facing the weak gap between the American 1st and 9th Armies. Although the thrust by the 6th Panzer Army made slow progress, a spearhead managed to break through the American line and dashed headlong for the Meuse. To the south, 5th Panzer Army punched right through the inexperienced 106th Division, but then its advance was slowed by the veteran 28th. Eventually, 5th Panzer Army did break through, reaching Saint-Vite and the vital road junction of Bastogne. However, the Germans failed to take the town, which was soon reinforced by the American 101st Airborne Division. Although some German units then bypassed Bastogne and charged for the Meuse, the main advance was blocked. To Allied commanders, the German offensive through the Ardennes had come as a stunning blow. No one had believed that the Germans were capable of mounting a large-scale attack. Nor had anyone imagined that Hitler would be so foolish as to risk his last remaining forces in one great gamble. The shock was deepened by the German use of special units, dressed and equipped as Americans, to sow confusion and mistrust in the American ranks. The Germans' success in the attack so far had been, in part, due to the weather. Many of the attacking troops were veterans of the Eastern Front and accustomed to the harsh wintry conditions. Dense cloud cover had also denied the Americans use of their reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. However, in spite of these advantages, the attack was already behind schedule. The Americans had refused to surrender at Bastogne, while elsewhere, blown bridges had slowed the advance, and all German units were suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel. Meanwhile, the Allies were recovering from the first shock of the onslaught. Almost at once, Eisenhower had moved to try and stabilize the situation in the Ardennes. Although it angered some American generals, he transferred command of the U.S. First and Ninth Armies away from Bradley and gave it to Montgomery, who was north of the Bulge and so better placed to command. Montgomery acted quickly, reinforcing the Meuse bridges with the British 30th Corps, while the 1st and 9th rallied and blocked any further German advance towards the river. While Montgomery was strengthening the Allied defence in the north, Patton's Third Army had made an extraordinarily rapid 90-degree wheel and had ploughed into the German southern flank. On the 26th of December, the 3rd broke through to relieve the defenders of Bastogne. Already the weather had cleared, unleashing Allied air power, while crippled by lack of fuel, the Germans ground to a halt at Dinant. The Allies had contained the German thrust, and now they began to squeeze out the massive bulge in the line caused by the German advance. Allied forces met up at Houffalize, and by the end of January, they had pushed the Germans back to their start positions. In the struggle that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies had lost almost 90,000 men, killed, wounded and captured, nearly all of them Americans. The Germans had lost 120,000, many of them because Hitler had refused to allow a timely withdrawal, even when the offensive had clearly failed. 600 German tanks had been destroyed, along with vast numbers of heavy weapons of all types. Months of the Reich's war production had been expended for nothing. Although at the Bulge the United States had won a sizable victory, the battle in the Ardennes had forced Eisenhower to face several uncomfortable facts. In the early stages of the fighting, American morale had fallen apart. Thousands had deserted, and the first GI for nearly 100 years had been executed for cowardice. For the Supreme Commander, it was a worrying picture, and the situation was made more difficult by the attitude of Field Marshal Montgomery. Shortly after the battle, Montgomery had hinted publicly that as he had been given temporary command of the U.S. First and Ninth Armies, he had saved the Americans from certain defeat. The American generals were furious, and Eisenhower threatened to resign if Montgomery did not do so first. By the start of 1945, relations between the American and British military had sunk to a new low. However, the crisis was averted when Montgomery apologized to Eisenhower. Even the willful and stubborn British Field Marshal had been forced to concede that with the Allies about to embark on the last great attack on Nazi Germany, unity was everything. The German counterattack in the Ardennes had succeeded in delaying the Allied push on the Rhine by only 6 weeks. By the end of January 1945, the supplies needed for the Great Assault were almost in place, and all 3 Allied army groups were poised to launch the offensive. Each army group had devised its own plans for reaching the River Rhine. Montgomery's 21st had a 2-pronged strategy, Operation Veritable and Operation Grenade, both timed to begin on the 8th of February. both prongs